We mean to cancel the world you civilized people made. We will simply erase history from the time that machinery and weapons threatened more than they offered. And when you die, the last living reminder of hell will be gone.
Kind of takes the fun out of being alive, doesn't it?
I see dead people. Dead people.
There will be no order, only chaos.
Kind of takes the fun out of being alive, doesn't it?
Only chaos.
One can makes you larger, and one can makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 2 years old.
And further down into that labyrinth we sojourn, my beloved truth seekers, after we have swallowed that red pill or taken a bite of that red apple, both one and the same symbolically, yet real incarnations of embryonic gnosis. But in that labyrinth, that rabbit hole of virgin wonderments, we also call anamnesis, Greek for remembering. We also must be wary because the archons and their bovine fury will gore us into forgetfulness and fear.
I'm a little concerned right now about your salvation and stuff.
So make sure you've got that golden cord out on the pathway, which represents who you really are becoming and where you truly belong, which is in the realm of the divine. That way you can remember your way back in case you don't break through the black iron prison. Until then, this is Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, or maybe Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis, or just CCG, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria this February 25th, 2007. My name is Miguel Connor, otherwise known as your host, Abraxas, the terrible god above God as the ancients knew him.
I am the god of hellfire!
The ye are all gods as well, as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, and we're finally realizing this after deciding we were going to climb towards the light out of Plato's cave, or more like Jehovah's labyrinth.
We can never see past the choices we don't understand.
And the cathartic truths keep coming at us like shards of sunlight dispersed in our imagination. Truths that help us forget the falsehoods that orthodoxy has planted in us like famished tapeworms of ignorance. And one of them is that it's become obvious to rethink one of the most hated characters in Christendom. And I don't mean Jerry Falwell. I mean Judas Iscariot, the man who allegedly betrayed the Savior in the Orthodox rendition. But this panorama of him, which I'm sure so many people have silently questioned throughout history, kind of like a nagging splinter, has been shaken to its foundation ever since the discovery of the Gospel of Judas.
Yea, yea, so you say. But one who sits amongst us has already betrayed me this night. Who can it be?
Judas! Do you want a beverage? Try the mulled wine. It's terrific. No! Leave us alone! Go! You're right.
To discuss the shift and the impact of Judas and his gospel, we are joined today by Marvin Meyer, author of The Gnostic Discoveries, The Impact of the Nag Hammadi Library, The Unknown Sayings of Jesus. He's the editor of the Gnostic Bible and professor of Bible and Christian Studies at Chapman University in California.
Whoa.
He is also one of the original translators of the Gospel of Judas. Marvin will explain and expand on this Gnostic scripture in ways you haven't heard before, including why it's been an earthquake in the psyche of Christianity.
Now open your mind to me.
You'll be pleasantly closer to the light after the interview. And what light it is! We've been held in too many shades of darkness for too long, my beloved truth seekers. For centuries we were lied about and marginalized Mary Magdalene. We were told that Christianity existed in one monolithic form only from the beginning. We were told that the true and only and unique God was the one in the Old Testament that often showed us his love with his fists.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law.
We were warned that only certain holy compilations could offer us relief from the material world. We were taught that only this phantom notion called faith was our only hope to the transcendental. But now we are finding out this is not the case. There is a whole other Christianity out there with far more options than we could have ever dreamed of. Or like Judas and Mary Magdalene, perhaps we thought of these options with some guilt during Sunday service. And one of them is that it's not just the death of Jesus that saved mankind, but his life, his teachings, and his mysteries. And Judas, just as fascinating and enigmatic as he was in Jesus Christ Superstar or The Last Temptation of Christ, is one of the filters through which the Logos imparted gnosis to the world.
I'm the saint of blasphemy.
There is still much interpretation and insights to be gleaned from the Gospel of Judas, no doubt. But what is important is that we know that we were cheated from the beginning of a rich tradition that doesn't condemn us for being alive, but unshackles us to a deeper reality while we are still alive.
All that is visible must grow beyond itself and extend into the realm of the invisible.
And more important is that the Savior and his bride, holy wisdom, are both inside and outside of us. Hell, even in the canonicals, I always like to point out to the literalists that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, during the Last Supper, tells all 12, Judas included, that they will rule in heaven sitting on thrones in proxy of the 12 tribes of Israel. I point out that Jesus called him friend in the Gospel of Luke, I believe, that without him there would be no dying and rising passion of the God-men, that Jesus, the great exorcist, allowed Satan to remain in his friend's heart all throughout the Last Supper and afterwards.
Was he working for someone? Yes, he's working for God. So God ordered a hit.
That from Mark to John there is a strange yet blatantly contrived transformation of Judas. That Judas has been a symbol of anti-Semitism for centuries because of his name, his depictions in art, and his marginalized actions. I tell him that the son of perdition should be vindicated because he truly is the high priest of the sacrifice of the dying and rising God-man. And I get nowhere because the Hylics are afraid to expand their consciousness until they are transparent to the healing rays of the Pleroma. Like Judas says in Jesus Christ Superstar, all your followers are blind, too much heaven on their minds. These literalists want the safety of being saved, instead of taking the risk into ultimate eternal awareness. They want their hollow faith instead of the nourishment of gnosis and wisdom.
We will not live by your commandments. We're free.
There is no freedom without the law.
But what are you going to do? I tell you what, my beloved truth seekers, continue through the labyrinth, that rabbit hole. Don't forget your cord or the fact you did take the red pill, and keep running against the wind, as Bob Seger sang, on this dark odyssey which will take us beyond the heavens and hells of this dilapidated universe. Like the Gospel of Thomas says, Jesus said, "The Pharisees and the scholars have taken the keys of knowledge and have hidden them. They have not entered, nor have they allowed those who want to enter to do so. As for you, be as wise as snakes and as innocent as doves." But we have those keys now. We are going home, just like Hypatia will eventually go home. We are the Gnostics. So let's risk one more turn in that labyrinth with a very stimulating talk with Marvin Meyer. Marvin, could you give us a brief history on how the Gospel of Judas was recovered and your involvement in it?
Well, to make that a brief history is somewhat difficult.
A thumbnail.
The story is an incredible story. The text was apparently discovered in Middle Egypt in the 1970s by a person from that area around Armenia who was poking around. He said he was in a cave and he found a burial in a cave, and in conjunction with that, some old books or codices. And then thereafter, the texts were shown around a little bit. They made their way to Europe. in a kind of surreptitious fashion. They finally came to the United States, and in the United States they were housed in a safe deposit box for quite a while on Long Island. Then they were purchased, or nearly purchased, by somebody in the Midwest who thought he would put them in deep freeze, and through all of this time there was more and more damage that was done to these texts until the very early part of this century, when finally the texts were made available. The various texts, including the Gospel of Judas, were made available to Rodolphe Kasser and to others of us, and we were able to translate and then make these texts a part of what the public in general can look at. And so the end result is a good one, that finally the Gospel of Judas and the other texts in the collection will be a part of our lives, and we can look at them and we can read these texts and so forth. But unfortunately, along the line, there was a fair amount of damage that was done to this fragile ancient papyrus, and so we've lost something too. We've lost phrases, there are holes in the text, lacunae, and so on. But nonetheless, with the Gospel of Judas, we're able to recover most of what is there and get a pretty good sense of this remarkable and rather dramatic text.
And now that the dust has settled for about a year, what new insights have been found on the examination of the Gospel of Judas? For example, I talked to John Turner the other day, and he told me that he found out that Judas wasn't really exposed as someone who chose to hate Jesus, but that Jesus just told him he was a fool for the stars. Is he correct, and what new insights do we have?
Yes. Well, there is a lot of work to be done on the Gospel of Judas yet. In fact, what we were able to do is three of us who were commissioned by the Maecenas Foundation and the National Geographic Society, that is Rodolphe Kasser from Switzerland, Gregor Wurst from Germany, and myself, we were able to work on this text and come out with a provisional translation, make that available along with a provisional Coptic text on the internet. We put out a popular book that has been before the public now and before scholars for a while, and very soon we'll have a critical edition, which is kind of the key thing to come out with. That is photographs, Coptic text, up-to-date translation of the Gospel of Judas and the other texts in this particular book or codex. But already there has been a lot of discussion, and various people that are scholars, students, lay people, clergy, folks in and out of the church, various folks have been weighing in on this text. And what becomes very interesting now is the fact that now scholars can all begin to look at this. We've tried to distribute, prior to the publication of the critical edition, copies of the Coptic text, transcriptions of the Gospel of Judas and the other texts, so that we all can look at this together. And now what becomes very exciting is the usual sort of scholarly debate and discussion. That is, now how do we interpret this? How do we understand this? What about the gaps in the text? Can we fill more of those? What do we think about the reading of the Coptic that has been presented? Are there any alternative possibilities for some of the ink traces that remain? And so various scholars are weighing in. The first conference that I know of that we had was a conference a few months ago in Paris at the Sorbonne, and a number of us, I guess maybe 25 to 30 scholars, came to the conference, maybe a few more than that, and we gave papers and had discussions and had a lot of good wine together and some good French food, and talked about Judas and interpretations of Judas. So we're at that particular point right now, that very exciting kind of point of being able to talk about how to interpret this and how to understand this. And through all of this, there are some, what shall I call them, revisionist interpretations coming out. I believe that the overall message of the Gospel of Judas is that the one disciple, according to the Gospel of Judas, who got it right, who had the right confession of who Jesus is, who was privy to the wisdom of Jesus, who heard the mysteries as they were unpacked by Jesus about the cosmos and the world above and this world, that the one disciple who was a part of all of this was, in fact, Judas Iscariot. But there are some key gaps in the text, and there are different ways of understanding some of the rather obscure phrases, so that there are some other interpretations that would suggest, well, maybe he wasn't such a positive figure after all. And John Turner and April Taconic, among other people, have suggested that maybe we should look at some of these other possibilities for interpreting some of the passages. And so it's that wonderful and that very exciting time that we're caught up in now, of having some great debate on this, and having various people weigh in on exactly what the Gospel of Judas means to communicate.
But I think one thing that probably is not for debate is that the Gospel of Judas is most definitely a Sethian work.
Well, I think that's pretty clear. Now, John Turner is a scholar of Sethian thought, and John is holding back a little bit on that. The last I talked to him, which was in Washington not too long ago, he said at that time that, well, it looks as if there are some Sethian elements in it. To be honest, everything that you would ever expect in an early Sethian text is found in this text. Barbelo is here, the Great Invisible Spirit is here, Adamas, Seth, all the folks are here. But the characteristics of this particular text would suggest, even as the date that is the most probable date, namely mid-2nd century or so, would also intimate, the characteristics would all suggest and point to the fact that this would be an early Sethian text that may say something about the relationship between Jewish Sethian thought and Christian Sethian thought, the development of Sethian ideas, including ideas about Sophia, wisdom, and what her fall might have been, whether that was so important for all of the Sethian text or not, because here seems to be a text where Sophia is mentioned, but she is not really a part of the central revelation as far as we can tell. So there are some characteristics here that are very, very interesting. In fact, I'm quite convinced, and am doing a variety of talks around and articles, and I'm writing a book on Judas text and so on, in order to argue a particular point, and that is, I believe that the central portion of the Gospel of Judas preserves what is essentially a Jewish Gnostic or Jewish mystical kind of revelation about the nature of the world, the devolution of the divine from the realms of infinity down into this world, and the career of the light as that finally enters into this world. And I think that portion that is put on the lips of Jesus in the Gospel of Judas is basically, fundamentally, essentially a Jewish tradition. That is very akin to other traditions of Jewish mysticism, and in fact, what becomes intriguing about this, even though the time span is a different kind of matter altogether, it does seem as if there are characteristics here that are akin to Kabbalah. Now,
really?
The history of Kabbalah does go back a little ways, and we know something about the full manifestation of Kabbalah at a later time. But there are a number of things that can be found in this variety of Jewish mysticism that are very close to what we see in the Gospel of Judas, and that all becomes, I think, just very, very interesting, a fascinating part of this text.
Yes, indeed, especially the Kabbalah angle. And so basically we have a Sethian core that might have been very early at times and then later Christianized, or the other way around?
I think so. That's how I see it. Now, this is not unusual for the Sethians, because with the Apocryphon of John, or the secret book of John, the same sort of thing seems to have happened. Namely, the text seems to be fundamentally a kind of a Jewish, mystical, Jewish Gnostic text that has been secondarily Christianized and now becomes a revelation of Jesus. But most of us, I think, who have studied that text carefully, which, of course, is fundamentally a Sethian text, in fact, it is a Sethian classic, most of us would agree that the Apocryphon, or secret book of John, also shows those same characteristics, namely, that it's built on a kind of Jewish foundation, and that what comes to expression then has been fairly lightly Christianized. Now, in the case of the Gospel of Judas, the Christianized quality is perhaps a bit more obvious and a bit more substantial, because finally here we have to do with stories about Jesus and Judas Iscariot, the other disciples, and it all finally leads up to the turning over, the handing over of Jesus toward the end of his life. But still, that central part, that core of the text, seems still to represent that kind of a pattern, namely a Jewish revelation that is not as dualistic as some of the other examples that we have of Sethian thought. There seems to be a kind of a gradual, as I have described it, evolution or devolution of the light above, the spirit above, into the realms below, down into this world, with what seems to be a gradual diminution of the light. Yet at the same time, the implication of the text is that Judas and all of us may be seen as people who can have a spark of that light within us. We just need to allow that to come to expression.
But doesn't the Gospel of Judas, doesn't Jesus claim that maybe some people don't have souls? Or that their spirits will not, that only the perfected race is the race that returns to Barbelo?
Well, there is a distinction between the generation of Seth, which is often referred to in a way that is akin to other Sethian references. It's often referred to as that generation, simply that generation. There's a distinction between that generation of Seth, mere mortals, people that are not privy to this kind of insight, that aren't on the inside, the outsiders. And so there does seem to be a distinction there between the insiders and the outsiders, those who are in the know and those who are ignorant, as a matter of fact. Now, what that finally means in terms of the fate of all people is not entirely clear from the text. But it does seem to suggest that there are certain people that are the people of Gnosis that would have a special knowledge and a special enlightenment, and perhaps they would be people that would have something of the spirit and the light and the knowledge of the divine within. And in fact, I guess I should go on to say that one of the characteristics of the Gospel of Judas is the fact that it's an impassioned gospel. It's a gospel with a lot of feeling about it. And some of the feeling is politically incorrect. As hostile as the heresiologists can get sometimes, so also the Gospel of Judas throws that hostility right back at apparently people in the great church. So that there are some pretty nasty things that are said seemingly about members of the emerging Orthodox Church, or at least the leadership. Ideas that would suggest that, this idea of Jesus as a sacrifice for the sins of people should be discarded, and the Eucharist, of what value is that? And perhaps as a new book about to come out by Elaine Pagels and Karen King may in fact be indicating, this whole idea of dying as a martyr and emulating the death of Jesus. What value is that? I mean, isn't that just like killing the children? That is, the children of God, and letting them die. So that there are some rather angry rejoinders in the Gospel of Judas that would suggest that the way that is emerging in the emerging Orthodox Church of piety and belief in sacrificial atonement and in one's own sacrifice of one's own life, that way might in fact be set aside and might be denied entirely out of interest in another way. That is, a way of gnosis, a way of enlightenment, a way of allowing the inner person and the spiritual person to come to full expression.
Did you get this through the visions that Jesus interprets, where he seems to be talking about the sacrificial lambs and the false gods and the temples and all that? So it's not so much against Orthodox Judaism, but it's against the Orthodox Church.
Right. This really is a part of, absolutely yes, this is really a part of the text that is rather clearly reflective of gospel interests and Christian interests and so on. And the distinctions between the group of people, whatever that group might be, that would stand behind the Gospel of Judas over against people in the emerging Orthodox Church. And yes, exactly so. In large part, this is based on a kind of a vision where the disciples say, we had a vision at the temple, and that seems to be a kind of description there that might in fact be based upon some Jewish critique of temple worship. There was that going on within Judaism too, but there's a description of the temple, maybe the temple in Jerusalem, and the animals being brought, and the priests there, and so forth. And that then seems to be interpreted in an allegorical way to say, now that's what's going on in these Christian temples, the Christian churches. And it's the same kind of sacrifice that's going on, and the sacrifice is just as bad in the churches, if not worse, than the sacrifices that you find elsewhere in the context of the Jewish temple. But yeah, that's the part that gets pretty harsh, in terms of just how wicked these people are and how wicked this approach is that places such an emphasis upon sacrifice. And of course, what we know very well is that emphasis upon sacrifice that comes to expression in various aspects of the early church, various presentations of the gospel in the early church, is with us to the present day. And one of the pieces of furniture in most every church around is the altar. And while nobody usually gets sacrificed on that altar these days, it is a reminder of the fact that this idea of sacrifice is very much a part of mainstream Christian tradition to the present day. That seems to be precisely what the Gospel of Judas is combating. And from that point of view, it becomes, I think, very interesting to think about that. What about the cross? If the Gospel of Judas seems not to care about any kind of salvific quality of the cross, how does that impact, then, discussions today? Do we need the cross today as a part of Christian tradition? Are there other ways of following Jesus, other ways of spirituality that may be more appropriate? And so the Gospel of Judas, for reasons like that, might play quite a role in terms of contemporary discussion.
Oh, indeed. Especially you had last Easter Pope Benedict out there with his polemics against the Gospel of Judas, telling Catholics, don't read it. So in that sense, yes, it has made a splash.
Yeah.
And also the scene in which at the Last Supper where Jesus starts laughing at them. Is that part of the polemics against the Orthodox Church or the old ways?
Well, I rather think so, because the language that is used there is the language about the Eucharistia, the Eucharist. Now, of course, Eucharist can mean thanksgiving and so forth. It can have a variety of meanings in Greek. It's a Greek loanword that is brought into the Coptic there. But any reader who is reading through this, and I would assume that the Greek original must have had that Greek word in too, if it survives right into the Coptic translation, any person who would read through this and notice the Greek word Eucharist, Eucharistia, would understand that it's not just Jesus laughing at the disciples having any old meal at this time, or having a kind of Last Supper. There are Eucharistic kinds of overtones to that, so that this would be yet another way of really saying, the Eucharist as a commemoration of the sacrifice of Jesus is laughable. It doesn't really have any power. It doesn't really have any significance, and why bother? And so there too, there's a kind of a collection of themes that swirl around this critique of sacrifice. Jesus dies for nobody's sins. Why celebrate a sacrifice of Jesus in the Eucharist? And why go to your death in emulation of the sacrifice of Jesus and become a martyr instead of allowing the real inner person to come to enlightenment and to realize your spirituality in that kind of way? That seems to be the kind of cycle of things that is being discussed here, and it's pretty provocative stuff.
Yeah, it's certainly very controversial to come. So the purpose of Jesus obviously is to come as a messenger of light and impart gnosis. In this text, and I got a little confused, Jesus is basically the allogenes in flesh form, or is he talking about a different Aeon, if you would?
He's not referred to in this text, though in the next text, in the Codex Chakos, he is referred to as allogenes, as the stranger or the foreigner. He is referred to in that way in that text. But still, I think your description is fairly apt. That is, it looks as if in this particular text, Jesus comes as somebody who is not from the demiurge, not from the Creator. That is to say, not from the God of the rest of the disciples. That's what Judas understands. That Jesus really comes from a transcendent realm. He comes from a realm where Judas and none of us would be worthy to pronounce the name. We couldn't pronounce the name of the ineffable being that is, in fact, in that realm. And in fact, the word barbelo is used in that context too. Sometimes barbelo is thought to be the exalted mother of God, the mother of the Redeemer, and so forth. Sometimes there's not that same kind of gender specificity connected with barbelo. But this is also a word, by the way, that most likely goes back to some kind of a Hebrew or Aramaic original, probably in Hebrew, as a matter of fact, with some kind of reference to the tetragrammaton. The best understanding we have of barbelo is that maybe it comes from Hebrew for God in four, that is, God in the four-letter name Yahweh, that unspeakable, ineffable, holy, holiest name that there is.
Oh,
so
that's
that Judas
Neo-Pythagorean, a little Neo-Pythagorean in there.
Yeah. Well, you know, the fact that Judas gets that, Judas understands that, and which is why Jesus says, you know, Judas, we can talk. And Judas becomes then the favored recipient of revelation thereafter and learns all the secrets and mysteries from Jesus, knowing where Jesus is really from. But it's the other disciples that think that Jesus seems to be from the Creator of this world. And Jesus says, no, I'm not from your God. They are apparently implying that their God is the Creator of this world, and Jesus claims to be from another kind of place altogether. That is to say, he is, as you said before, something of a stranger in this world. He comes from a spiritual realm, an exalted kind of realm, and then uses a body, it seems. That is how I would take the conclusion of the text. The text is difficult to read at the end, in large part because there are some gaps in the text. Just when we would like to know, who really is transfigured here, I think it's probably Judas, but it could theoretically be Jesus who is transfigured at the end. Just when we'd like to know what really happens just before Judas turns Jesus into the authorities at the end of the text, we have these gaps in the text, unfortunately. But what seems to be happening there is Jesus turns to Judas and he says, you will exceed all of the others, probably the other disciples, for you will sacrifice the man who bears me. And as I read that, it seems clear to me that refers to the fact that Jesus is wearing or is using or is inhabiting flesh, but that the real person of Jesus, the real person of the Redeemer, indeed, the real person for each one of us is the inner person. That's the real human being. We are more than our biology, but there is something spiritual about us. That's, I think, what this text says, and that is what Jesus is, too, and what he says and implies about himself, that he's more than just the flesh that bears him and carries him around. And in fact, that finally is what is going to be crucified. The flesh will be crucified. But that doesn't mean that the inner person dies or that the real person somehow comes to an end. So that to that extent, Jesus and all of us would be seen to be individuals in this world, insofar as we are people of Gnosis, who are more than our biological bodies. But the real person of us is that inner person, that spiritual person.
And moving on historically, are we pretty much sure that this is the Gospel of Judas that Irenaeus talked about, since he never quoted it?
Right, he never quoted it, and it's not even clear that he ever saw it, as a matter of fact. He knew about it, and he knew something about it, but his words are pretty general. If you read through his description, it fits in some kind of a general way with the contents of the Gospel of Judas, as we have recovered that in Coptic translation. There are some words that are used, some outrage that Irenaeus has.
What a surprise.
Yeah, that would fit the character.
Cranky old coot.
Of this text, yeah. Yeah, he was pretty grouchy about it, yeah. So I think it's a very good supposition that we have to do here with a Coptic translation, generations removed, to be sure, from the Greek original that was composed in the middle or so of the 2nd century that Irenaeus knew about. Now, we would also assume that probably in the meantime it had been copied and recopied and so on, and usually in antiquity when things were copied and recopied, there was editing that was done, and changes, in fact, were made. So there may, in fact, be ways in which that happened. I mean, that happens with all texts. It happened with the Bible. It happened with other texts that we know of from ancient collections. It must have happened with the Gospel of Judas, too, that there would be some updating and some editing that would happen along the way. But the fact of the matter is, I think there's good reason to connect this as a Coptic translation in that particular way with the text that Irenaeus knew about.
And what about the Cainites? Do we really know anything about them, or were they created by the Church Fathers just to have another boogeyman to kick around?
Well, we know of no self-respecting Cainites out there. We know of no people that called themselves Cainites. My guess is that the heresy hunters were simply looking for some really bad labels to lay on people. In fact, what is going on here is connected much more clearly with people that Irenaeus says called themselves Gnostikoi, Gnostics. That's one of the reasons why I still feel very comfortable using the word Gnosis and the word Gnostic. I don't feel quite as comfortable talking about Gnosticism because that is a modern term with the ism on the end. And we know that there were many different kinds of folks who bought into one kind of Gnosis or another. But Irenaeus says that some people, like the people that used the Apocryphon or secret book of John and the Gospel of Judas, that some of these people called themselves Gnostics. And they use that word. And so if they use that word as a term of self-designation, then that makes me much more comfortable using that term too. I bring this up because, as I guess we all know, there is a debate going on about whether we should talk about the Gnostics anymore or not.
Right.
Well, I mean, if there were people that said, we want to be called Gnostics and we call ourselves Gnostics, then I'm willing to call them Gnostics too, in that way, when it becomes that kind of a term of self-designation. So whether there actually were Cainites, I am not sure. I don't know what to make of that kind of term. But I do know that the word Cain does crop up every once in a while. It's not the most common term, but it does crop up every once in a while in certain texts, and it does crop up occasionally in some Sethian texts. But it's not a term that is used a great deal. But who knows what texts might still survive in the sands of Egypt, and maybe we'll find out more about Cain, or how the name of Cain and the person of Cain might have been used by some of these folks.
Yeah, maybe we'll find the Gospel of Cain.
Yes, that would be like exciting indeed, wouldn't it?
Yes. And Marvin, why do you think there is such an obsession with the Gospel of Judas? I mean, every other guest I interview wants to write a book on it, and like you said, there's many books coming out. Elaine Pagels and Karen King was one example you use. I mean, it seems to to me to have taken some of the interest of the Hammadi library, which I think still needs to be worked very hard. What makes Judas so tantalizing to the public?
Well, I'll tell you, Miguel, that's a very interesting question that you raise, and I suppose that you can speculate on that, and I can speculate on that, but the interest has been just phenomenal. And part of it is, I suppose, the world we live in, the age that we're involved in. We're well connected internationally with each other through various means of communication. The internet has made this a very small kind of world in terms of passing information from one place to another. And National Geographic is a society that is very well connected internationally as well, so that for them to be involved and for them to make an announcement and to do it in conjunction with a couple of books that were done early and a television program and a website and to fire the whole thing up at one time together does make a difference. But I think there's more than that. I think that probably the title itself is the first thing that just fascinates people. The fact that there is a gospel that is a statement of Christian good news, that is a gospel of Judas Iscariot, that miserable traitor, that quintessential betrayer of the master, that there's any good news connected with Judas. I think it's so shocking and so surprising that the title itself makes people just step back and say, what's going on here? And then to find out that within the Gospel of Judas, Judas Iscariot, in fact, is the one disciple who seems to know who Jesus is. He is praised by Jesus. He is privy to all of the secrets about the world and about God in the world according to Jesus. He's taken aside for that special kind of instruction that nobody else seems to get except for everybody who can read the text. And then he has a role to play that Jesus announces to him at the very end that seems to involve sacrifice, yes, but not sacrifice for sins. That is a different kind of sacrifice altogether. The only kind of sacrifice that matters, that is transcending the flesh and realizing our spiritual self. So to understand that here is a Judas who is a positive Judas. This isn't that bad boy Judas that has been critiqued and demonized and vilified throughout the entire tradition. And in fact, now what is happening with some people also becomes interesting. And I have been lecturing literally, Miguel, around the world on this.
Sure.
But people are now looking back at the New Testament Gospels to say, how did we get such a bad boy Judas, this poster boy of anti-Semitism and so on? How did we ever get him? If, in fact, here's a gospel where he seems to be a much more positive figure. And what we are finding out is that, the story of Judas in the New Testament deserves a second or a third or a fourth look. Because it may be that something is going on there that is worth looking at. It may well be that the New Testament story of Jesus and of Judas would suggest that Jesus and Judas were good friends, and that Judas was a part of the inner circle, and that Judas might have been a very trusted part of the inner circle, that Judas might have been one of the best friends of Jesus, and that what actually happened and is often described as and translated as betrayal may not have been exactly betrayal at all. It may have been handing Jesus over to the authorities, introducing him, as some other scholars have even said before, so that Jesus and the Jewish authorities could talk together about their vision of reform within Judaism. And then something went terribly wrong.
And even the word in Greek for betrayal is the same as handing over, isn't it?
Well, absolutely.
So.
Paradidomi means give over or hand over. And in fact, what's interesting, if you would look in the earliest author of the New Testament, Paul says, oh yes, Jesus was handed over. Paul, by the way, never mentions Judas, doesn't seem to know Judas, just talks about the 12, and doesn't have any kind of tricky little story about, well, they got to be down to 11 because of Judas, and so they had to have an election for Matthias to be selected. Paul knows nothing about that, never mentions that. But Paul says, oh yeah, Jesus was handed over, to be sure, and he finally was crucified. But when he finally says, using the same Greek verb, who handed Jesus over, Paul says, well, God handed him over. Or in another place, Jesus handed himself over, using the same verb. So it may be that the Gospel of Judas becomes the occasion for us to have a broader discussion of what the earliest texts that we have, namely New Testament texts, might really say about Judas. Now, to be sure, in these texts there is a growing kind of demonization of Judas that already occurs. And you can see that chronologically when those texts are laid out from Mark through Matthew and Luke to John, those New Testament Gospels are increasingly hostile toward Judas as time passes. And I really see that as a part of the editing process. That is, more and more blame is being placed on not the Romans, but on the Jewish people.
And that's what Judas represents.
And on Judas as being a bad Jewish person. So that the Romans can get off the hook and Pilate can turn into a pretty positive guy who washes his hands and he's okay, And so who really is responsible for it? A bad Jew, who has a name, in fact, that even sounds like he is just a Jew, Judah, or Judas. So that it becomes...
And his last name, too, is also a negative name, isn't it? Iscariot?
Well, we're not really sure what Iscariot means, as a matter of fact. There are a number of possibilities. I think the best possibility is that that it means that he is an ish, a man in Hebrew or in Aramaic, a man of Keriot, a man of the city, maybe a man of the village of Keriot. We're really not sure about that. There have been other suggestions that he's one of the Sicarii, one of the daggermen of the assassins. Kind of an attractive idea, but it doesn't really fit too well. And other possibilities too. We're not really sure what the name means, but it may be a way to place him in Judea, place him around Jerusalem. We're not really sure what that means. Yeah. But that becomes, I think, part of the reason why this moment becomes interesting, because I think that some people are saying, including people that are in the church, there are people that are saying, maybe there is another story here of the various stories we've been hearing about that we've not heard about in church for a while. What we heard before about Thomas is that he's doubting Thomas. Kind of a bad dude, couldn't quite get it straight until he would touch the wounds. And now we find out that there's a Gospel of Thomas out there. What we heard before is that Mary Magdalene was a whore. A repentant whore, but she was a whore. Now we find out, whoops, she might not have been, and almost certainly was not, a prostitute at all, but might have been one of the closest disciples to Jesus. And now we find out another story, too, about Judas. And I think people are excited to find out that, the church was and remains, Christianity was and remains a very diverse phenomenon. There are a lot of things going on here. And it's not just one line, it's not just one orthodoxy, it's not just one truth, but there are many truths, there are many ways, there are many gospels and many interpretations that can be embraced. And I think that many people find that to be very exciting.
Right. It's nice to know that early Christianity was actually very fluid, unlike what Acts of the Apostles or tradition and everything says. There was a lot of them.
Of course, this is all going on, before Constantine began to fiddle around with things and to introduce, in a rather overt way, political elements into discussion. It's before the time that dogma is getting settled. It's before the time of creeds, that will tell who is on the inside and who is on the outside, So before all of that happened, in the beginning, there was diversity. There were different gospels and different ways and different beliefs, and there were arguments, to be sure, about this. But there certainly were a variety of different ways of approaching Jesus and following Jesus.
And as you mentioned before, you're perfectly comfortable with calling the Gnostics the Gnostics. You haven't jumped on the Karen King or James Robinson or Elaine Page's bandwagon yet.
Well, these are all friends, and we have good discussions about this. I simply use the word gnosis, and I use the word Gnostic, derived from gnostikos, because the heresiologists admit that these terms are being used by their opponents, that there are people out there that call themselves gnostikoi and Gnostics. And for that reason, if they can call themselves that, I feel that it is legitimate for us to use that word too. Now, the word Gnosticism, as I mentioned before, is a modern term. I prefer to stay away from that. And also, I don't want to bring all of the baggage that comes from the heresiologists to say that, well, if you're a Gnostic, that means that you're a heretic. In fact, all of this language, and to this extent, I agree completely with Karen King. I think that her book, What is Gnosticism, is a brilliant book, even though I disagree with aspects of it. But certainly, when it comes to the understanding of what is orthodoxy and what is heresy, there are very powerful and dramatic political and rhetorical aspects to orthodoxy and heresy. Orthodoxy is defined by the winners. Orthodoxy is defined by those who have the loudest voices, what are deemed to be the strongest arguments, and the most votes. And those who lose in that debate are called heretics. There are very few people that refer to themselves, unless we're in a different kind of world of discourse. There are very few people that call themselves heretics that say, I'm on the wrong road, you know. This becomes a term of accusation and of rhetoric. I think that's exactly right. And so when Irenaeus and Hippolytus and even much more so Epiphanius and some other folks, when they use words like Gnostic, they mean it to be a kind of a club to beat people with. And certainly I think that is entirely inappropriate if we're trying to be fair to the people that Irenaeus understands, call themselves Gnostics. And the folks that we often refer to as the Sethians are people that apparently, according to Irenaeus, call themselves Gnostikoi. So if they call themselves that, I would be happy to do them the service of abiding by the same kind of name that they preferred.
You talk about the other codex that's found. Is the Allogenes Codex the same found in the Nag Hammadi library, or is this a complete different one?
As far as we can tell, it's an entirely different text. There actually were several different books that were found, or codices that were found, a Greek translation of the book of Exodus, some Coptic versions of letters of Paul, a Greek mathematical treatise. Various books were found like this. But in Codex Chakos, there were at least 4 texts. There was the Gospel of Judas, of course, as the third text. But before that, there was a version of the letter of Peter to Philip, a book called, a text called James, which is a version of the first apocalypse or revelation of James, also known from Nag Hammadi. Both of those first 2 documents are known from Nag Hammadi as well. And then the third text is the Gospel of Judas. And the fourth text is a text that we are calling, though only a fragment of the title remains, we're calling it the Book of Allogenes, or the Book of the Stranger. And this actually was available for quite some time on the Internet, on some of the sites out there. There were photographs, transcriptions of it, and so on, that had been made available some time ago. But now it appears not to be a part of the Gospel of Judas at all, but rather it's its own separate text, the Book of the Stranger, the Book of Allogenes. This, unfortunately, is a text that is quite fragmentary, and so only a few pages remain, and then a bunch of fragments. But now, lo and behold, there is some evidence to suggest that, in fact, Codex Chakos might have been much longer, and part of it might be missing or destroyed, and there is the word tris megistus, thrice greatest.
The Hermetic.
Some fragments. And Jean-Pierre Mahe has had a chance to look at some of these materials, and he thinks that there is a Coptic translation of a Hermetic text, maybe Corpus Hermeticum 13, that great text, as a matter of fact, might have been a part of this as well. So who knows? Maybe there are more pages of the Codex out there.
We can only hope.
So, people that would have access would just make this available. There might be more that we can learn. Or perhaps these pages have turned into dust. And if so, we have lost a great deal. But that's what we have, at least at this point, with the hope that there may be more that comes to light in the future.
I hope so too, and I hope you keep working on it. You certainly show a lot of passion for it.
Well, it's a very exciting moment. I feel honored, and I feel that it has been just a marvelous adventure to be at this particular place and to have been able to play some kind of role in making this available to the public. I think it's a great text, and it's a great moment, and I think that as we have a chance to read these texts and learn from these texts, we will all be the better for it.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Well, I think that should do it. Thank you very much for taking your time today, Marvin. And
well, it's really a pleasure, Miguel, and I wish you all the best.
Likewise, and we'll talk to you soon.
Very good. Take care.
God is love. I don't love you.